On March 12, 2026, something unusual happened during a live press conference in Israel. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stood before reporters, speaking about Israel's strength and the ongoing war with Iran. Cameras were rolling, the world was watching, and then suddenly, air raid sirens began to echo across central Israel. Within seconds, the atmosphere changed. Military alerts appeared. Security officials rushed to confirm what had just happened. Israel's defense systems had detected another wave of ballistic missiles launched from Iran. Not the first attack of the day, the sixth. At that exact moment, Netanyahu was still speaking. For a brief second, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. While Israel's leader talked about military dominance, Iran was demonstrating that it still had the ability to strike. 13 days into the conflict, thousands of military targets had already been hit. Billions of dollars had already been spent. And yet, Iran was still launching missiles. So what is really happening in this war? Is Israel actually winning as quickly as officials initially claimed? Or is the reality far more complicated? Today, we're going to break down the facts behind this conflict. What Netanyahu admitted during that press conference, what Iran claims, what Israeli officials claim, and what international intelligence assessments suggest. Because once you understand the details behind that moment, the air raid sirens during Netanyahu's speech, the entire picture of this war begins to look very different. During that press conference, Netanyahu delivered a series of remarks that quickly captured the attention of international analysts and security observers across the world. At first, his tone focused heavily on strength and resolve, emphasizing Israel's determination to confront and ultimately defeat its enemies, while reiterating the broader strategic objective of preventing Iran from evolving into a long-term regional threat. He spoke about Israel's commitment to maintaining security and stability, framing the conflict as part of a larger effort to stop hostile powers from gaining dangerous military advantages. Yet hidden within those statements was a detail that dramatically shifted how many experts interpreted the situation on the ground. Netanyahu explained that Iran had not been caught unprepared for such a confrontation. Instead, it had spent many years anticipating the possibility of direct conflict and quietly building a defense structure designed specifically for it. According to his description, a large portion of Iran's most critical military capabilities had been deliberately placed deep beneath the surface, protected by layers of earth and reinforced structures. These included missile facilities, strategic weapon systems, and even components connected to Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Netanyahu noted that these installations were constructed at such extreme depths that eliminating them entirely would be exceptionally difficult using conventional means. In fact, he suggested that if military action had been postponed even further, some of those underground complexes might have reached a point where they would be almost completely immune to standard aerial strikes. That admission carried major implications because it revealed an important limitation in the ongoing campaign. If the most crucial capabilities are hidden far underground, then the effectiveness of an air war has natural boundaries. Airstrikes can devastate surface infrastructure, destroy visible launch platforms, and damage exposed military sites, but deeply buried systems are far harder to neutralize. And if those hardened facilities remain intact, they can continue to support operations such as missile launches, even while other targets are being hit. This possibility may help explain why Iran was still able to fire repeated missile salvos nearly 2 weeks into the conflict, despite the intensity of the attacks against it. For military analysts studying the situation, that moment in the press conference stood out as particularly revealing because it suggested that the early narrative portraying the campaign as an overwhelming and decisive success might have been somewhat optimistic, and that the true complexity of the conflict was only beginning to emerge. From Iran's perspective, however, the conflict is being interpreted and presented in a very different way. Iranian officials maintain that their military planning has long been built around the expectation that any major confrontation with Israel, or potentially with the United States, would likely begin with a powerful wave of airstrikes targeting key military infrastructure. Because of that long-standing assumption, Iran claims it deliberately invested significant time and resources into ensuring the survivability of its military capabilities under exactly those circumstances, rather than relying solely on large, easily identifiable bases that could be targeted from the air. Iranian planners focused on building a far more dispersed and concealed defensive network. This included underground missile tunnels carved deep into mountains, mobile launch platforms designed to relocate quickly, and hardened bunkers reinforced specifically to withstand sustained aerial bombardment. The idea behind this approach was to create a system where even if many locations were discovered and destroyed, enough of the network would remain intact to continue operating. By spreading capabilities across multiple hidden and protected sites, Iran aimed to complicate any attempt to eliminate its missile forces in a single campaign. In essence, Iranian officials suggest that their strategy was never centered on achieving a rapid or decisive victory in the opening stages of a war. Instead, the focus was on endurance, on maintaining enough operational capacity to keep responding over time, even while under heavy attack. The continued missile launches seen during the conflict appear, from Tehran's perspective, to support that claim, indicating that despite the damage inflicted by airstrikes, some portions of the infrastructure designed to survive and retaliate are still functioning and capable of carrying out strikes. One of the most alarming incidents took place only a few days before the March 12th press conference, when a ballistic missile struck near a civilian shelter in central Israel, an event that immediately intensified concerns among both officials and the public. The impact occurred in an area where civilians had been seeking protection, and the consequences were severe. Several civilians lost their lives, and dozens more were injured, some seriously, as emergency responders rushed to the scene. According to initial reports, missile interceptors had been launched in an attempt to destroy the incoming projectile before it could reach the ground, but in this instance, they failed to hit their target in time. For defense planners and military analysts, moments like this raise serious and uncomfortable questions about the reliability of even the most sophisticated defensive systems. Israel's national security strategy has long depended on a multi-layered protection model built around three critical components working in coordination: early detection systems that track incoming threats, civilian warning networks that alert the population and give people time to reach shelters, and missile interception technology designed to destroy threats before they strike populated areas. When all three layers operate together effectively, the chances of catastrophic damage are significantly reduced, and many attacks can be mitigated before they cause widespread harm. However, when one or more of those layers fails, even for a brief moment, the consequences can be devastating, as a single successful strike can penetrate the defense shield and reach civilian areas. Incidents like this therefore serve as a stark reminder of how intense and unpredictable modern missile warfare can be, highlighting the reality that even highly advanced defense systems can face moments of vulnerability when subjected to sustained and repeated attacks. Another significant moment during the press conference centered on the long-term political objectives behind the conflict and what its broader consequences might eventually be. Netanyahu suggested that the ongoing war could, over time, create conditions that might encourage political change inside Iran, hinting at the possibility that sustained military pressure could weaken the authority and stability of the current Iranian leadership. Some policymakers supporting this view argue that prolonged strategic pressure, combined with economic strain and internal dissatisfaction, might gradually erode the government's ability to maintain control. However, when journalists pressed Netanyahu on whether Israel could realistically guarantee such an outcome, his response became noticeably more cautious and measured. Rather than presenting regime change as a certain result, he acknowledged that any true political transformation inside Iran would ultimately depend on the Iranian people themselves, not on external military actions alone. That careful clarification carried important implications for analysts following the conflict. While military campaigns can certainly weaken governments, damage key infrastructure, and create intense political pressure, they rarely provide a reliable path to guaranteed political change. History repeatedly shows that attempts to reshape another country's political system through external force are highly unpredictable, and often produce outcomes very different from what planners initially expect. Governments under pressure sometimes collapse, but in many cases they adapt, consolidate support, or rally nationalist sentiment in response to outside threats. Because of that uncertainty, Netanyahu's answer subtly underscored a larger reality. Even if military objectives are achieved in the short term, the long-term political consequences inside Iran remain far from certain, leaving the ultimate direction of the conflict's political impact unresolved. So where does this conflict go from here? At this stage, several different possibilities remain on the table, and none of them can yet be ruled out. One scenario is that the war continues in its current form, with limited but persistent missile exchanges and periodic airstrikes carried out by both sides as each attempts to weaken the other without triggering a much larger regional confrontation. Another possibility is that increasing diplomatic pressure from major global powers could eventually push both sides toward negotiations, especially if international concerns about stability, economic disruption, and humanitarian consequences begin to intensify. There is also the more concerning scenario in which the conflict gradually expands beyond the current actors, drawing additional groups or countries into the situation and widening the scope of the confrontation across the region. Because of these uncertainties, military analysts and strategic observers are closely monitoring several key indicators that could shape what happens next. The first is Iran's remaining missile capability and whether it can sustain continued launches over time despite ongoing attacks on its infrastructure. The second is Israel's interception success rate, which plays a crucial role in determining how effectively incoming threats can be neutralized before they reach populated areas. The third factor involves the potential involvement of regional allies on both sides, including armed groups or partner states that might choose to intervene either directly or indirectly. If additional actors begin to participate, the scale and complexity of the conflict could increase dramatically, potentially transforming what is currently a bilateral confrontation into a much broader regional crisis with far-reaching consequences. The moment when sirens suddenly interrupted Netanyahu's speech became more than just a dramatic headline circulating through global media. It served as a powerful reminder that the conflict is still unfolding and far from reaching any clear conclusion. While early reports and official statements had suggested the possibility of rapid and decisive success, the reality on the battlefield now appears far more complex and uncertain. Missiles continue to be launched, defense systems remain under constant pressure, and each new exchange highlights how dynamic and unpredictable the situation has become. Even highly advanced interception networks are being repeatedly tested, and every incident demonstrates how difficult it is to fully shield civilian populations during prolonged missile warfare. At the same time, the political dimension of the conflict remains unresolved, with no clear indication yet of how events will shape the broader strategic balance in the region. Military actions may influence the situation in the short term, but the long-term outcome, whether political, diplomatic, or military, is still very much in question. In that sense, the moment when the sirens cut through the press conference symbolized something larger than a single interruption. It illustrated how the war is continuing to evolve in real time, with new developments capable of shifting the narrative at any moment. So the question now is, what comes next? Will the confrontation escalate further as both sides continue testing each other's limits? Or will diplomatic efforts eventually begin to slow the momentum and open a path toward de-escalation? The answer remains uncertain, and the coming weeks could prove critical in determining the direction of events. What do you think will happen next? Will the conflict intensify, or will negotiations eventually take priority? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you're interested in more detailed breakdowns and analysis like this, make sure to subscribe, because during moments of global tension and fast-moving developments, understanding the facts and context matters more than ever.